My name is Kelly Yarbrough, and I'm the Director of Community Programming at Prairiewood Retreat and Preserve in Manhattan, Kansas. Normally, I'd be busy coordinating our public event series, like yoga, open trail days, and artist receptions. But it's a weird time. In-person public programming is out. But I can't help noticing that some things haven't changed. The earth is still spinning, and spring is upon us. We still need sunshine and fresh air. We need connection to each other and to places that matter. The Places Between Us is part podcast, part walking tour. Conversations from a distance with artists, poets, educators, and changemakers as they take us on virtual walks through their own special places. Hello? Hey, Kail. Can you hear me? I can't hear you. Unmute. Oh. How about now?
There you go. I think I was on mute. Okay. Why does it say recording?
Because I'm recording.
Right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm recording for audio. Audio
Right.
only.
Right. I'm not on video. It is irrelevant what I look like or how I express myself.
Exactly. Well,
Except verbally.
verbally.
And so, okay, go ahead and tell me what we're doing. So
Yeah. Basically, I think what I'm going to do here is share my screen with you. And so we're going to see this video that I filmed this time of walking through Willis Prairie. And we'll kind of just have a casual conversation. The idea is to have a sense that we're just having a walking chat.
Okay.
That's good. So we're heading towards the Willis Prairie Trail now here. What is it? It's early April.
Oh, we're gonna turn left and go down into one of my favorite little hollows.
Yeah, why is this your favorite?
Well, for one, the trees down here, I feel like they're something out of a movie, maybe out of some enchanted forest in Lord of the Rings or something. A couple of the oak trees have these really gnarly branch configurations. We just walked by one a second ago, but there's just a kind of an enchantedness to this little hollow down here. I think the cedars kind of darken it in a little bit, and then there's all these hardwood oaks that, as I mentioned, a few of them have these just kind of unique branch configurations. You can see one there. They have these hollows and these knots, and I'm always fascinated by trees in general, but especially oaks, because they seem to have so much characteristic. It's almost like you can get inside them and see the past somehow.
Yeah, I agree. I know, like, obviously this is early spring, and so the prairie's just starting to come back alive, but this is a really lovely area down here. And this spring too, I mean, I think the first couple of years I started here, it was pretty much dry the whole time because we were in kind of a drought before, but with last year it was so wet, this spring was running for most of the year, and a lot of the springs on the property were flowing, right?
Yeah, this last year, I would say the spring-fed ravines and creeks probably flowed more months than not. And you're right, that is depending on the spring, that is unique from an annual standpoint. I would there's a few springs on the property that run almost year round without exception, but many of them are rather seasonal. And this year has been a wetter year, and I think the water tables are up, and which is a really, really nice feeling to feel like our aquifers and water tables are back up.
Why is it called Willis Prairie?
Well, the original namesake of the prairie was our good neighbor and late neighbor, Bill Willis, and his dear wife, Jean.
I have to stop for flowers sometimes. That's some yarrow.
Oh, it is yarrow.
Blooming yet. Yeah, I like walking this loop over here because I think I've noticed like some kind of standout flowers on this loop.
This is one of my favorite little spots on the entire property, and I have a lot of favorites. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased, but I think the reason this kind of captures my fascination is one of the early prairie books I read came from the K-State Library, and it was a book on prairie restoration, but it talked about this idea of savanna. And you can see right here as you're panning and seeing these oak trees right there, that is what this book defined as prairie savanna. And I had never heard that term before. And but we can all probably picture, even if we haven't been there, we can picture the African savanna that we see in movies where these singular kind of gnarly trees are kind of sitting out on the savanna. You're not in the forest, you're in the grasslands, but these trees have survived. And as you saw back there, there's this stand of oak trees that's still surrounded by prairie, and it's the closest thing on the entire property to what this book described as prairie savanna. And it's where the fire lines compete with the woodland ravines, and you get these few outliers of woody species and oaks that sort of grow up and usually grow slower than they would if they were down in the ravine. So
yeah, that's cool. The savanna concept is neat, and it's neat to think about how the different grasslands around the world are connected by some similar features, but some unique qualities as well.
I agree, and they really are so connected.
Oh, we have to take a quick break for some mead sedge.
Oh, hey, look at that.
Sedges have edges, as the saying goes. You can feel the stems have edges, unlike grasses, which are flat.
I remember being a docent at the Kanza Prairie, which I know you're a docent at, and I remember beginning to become familiar with the idea that people come from all around the world to the Kanza to do research on grasslands, and the reason they do that is because in many ways grasslands share more similar characteristics than they're different, and so those similarities allow scientists to look at common characteristics that express themselves differently depending on the hemisphere they're in and depending on the specific topography and elevation they're in, but they behave enough similarly that you can glean a lot of information that we can learn things about the African grasslands by studying Kansas grasslands. And it's really powerful to sort of think about all the grasslands of the world sharing kind of, a common DNA.
Yeah. There's your prairie parsley.
Thank you. Did you have a bite of that? One of my favorite things to do with prairie parsley when I take people on walks, and when they're tender, they taste uniquely like parsley, or even more acute is they taste almost exactly, to most people's taste, they taste like celery.
Well, I'm curious to know a little bit more about the history of this land and how you got involved. When did you first encounter this place?
There's the long version of that answer, and then there's the long version, and then there's the abbreviated version. And you can see now we're winding upland. We're one of the unique things about Willis Prairie, which is part of our entire Prairiewood Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. This particular section of Willis Prairie is really an entire watershed, and we're really fortunate and unique to have an entire watershed kind of encompassed in the 200 acres that are in this particular Willis Prairie. Willis Prairie is about 200 acres, and then of course we have other parcels and pieces connected to it that make up more acreage, but we're headed up into that watershed as we're walking, so we're gaining elevation, headed up toward those high ridges that you can see in the background there. And look at that, Kelly.
Ground plums. They don't have plums yet, but cool. Next to some celery, parsley.
I was gonna say, yeah, some prairie parsley. These are all so small, and one of the things I sort of, among other reasons I love the prairie is because it sort of sings softly compared to glaciers or mountains. Every landscape has a song, and but some of them are softer, and you have to quiet yourself to hear the music a little more than in some other landscapes. And the prairie is a really softly sung voice. And these flowers that you're taking the time to kneel down and zoom into, I mean, these are tiny, delicate little expressions that could often be overlooked if you were moving too fast or you weren't attentive. And I sort of think that's a good lesson that we can apply to lots of life, that there is beauty and wonder all around, but only when we take time to see and watch and wonder do we really get to experience it in its fullness. So I love, as we're talking, to watch the times you sort of spot something and kneel down to show what it is. But on camera it looks big, but in real life, from a standing standpoint, you could walk right over some of these flowers, and if you weren't paying attention, you wouldn't notice them. So I remember early on, my first experience of this particular piece of land was when my neighbor, Bill Willis, who I mentioned earlier, one of our very, very favorite people that we met shortly after moving out to Wildcat Creek Road. And Bill and Jean were delightful people. They sort of embodied the spirit of welcome and wonder and hospitality that we still are searching for today. And so Bill Willis lived a little ways down, and this was his hobby prairie, and he loved the tallgrass prairie. He was a wheat disease extension specialist at K-State, and he and his wife Jean lived down the road, and he absolutely loved the tallgrass prairie. And he had bought this and stewarded this piece of land for from the time we had moved out to Wildcat Creek, which was over 20 years ago now. And so the first time Bill brought me up here, it was to show me he was trying to eradicate some of the thistles that some of the noxious thistles that were in his opinion taking over areas that he didn't want them. And so he was digging them up one by one, and it was sort of this labor of love in that moment. And I understood a lot about Bill when I understood he would go onto a 200-acre piece of land and try to singularly dig up, instead of spraying them with chemicals, he'd dig them up, and was trying to keep them from spreading in places that he obviously didn't want them. So, and then, years later, Bill knew that he wasn't going to keep this forever. And we had talked to him about what we were doing with Prairiewood, but Bill reached out and he said, I know you and Becky are trying to protect all this, but and this tells you a lot about Bill. He said, the problem is I have had so many people ask me to buy this land, and I know whoever I sell it to, I'm going to hurt everybody else's feelings, and I just can't live with that. And so I don't have any other choice but to put it up at auction. And I was kind of heartbroken about that at the moment, but looking back, it tells me a lot about Bill. I mean, he couldn't figure out how to play favorites. And even though he knew we were trying to put together Prairiewood Preserve, he just couldn't bring himself to tell one person yes when telling other people no. So he secretly told me later he hoped that we'd be able to pull it off, because we were probably going to do with it more what he wanted than anyone else had a concept for, which our concept was just to preserve it as prairie. And we went to that auction, and the abbreviated version, Kelly, is that in a way, still to this day, I can't explain. There were about 75 people in the room. I'd never been to a public auction before, actually. I've been to estate sales, but not public auctions for land. And the bidding started, and it started at some astronomical price, and no one bid. And then they dropped the price and no one bid. And then they dropped the price and no one bid. And then they dropped the price and no one bid. And finally, it went down to a price that no one was bidding on. And I just knew for certain was way under what it probably should sell for. And I put in a bid, and expecting that the bidding to start. And interestingly, going once, going twice, and in this room of 75 people, no one bid on it. And
Wow.
So, yeah, I don't know if I've ever shared the detail of that story. So the takeaway was that in some way I can't explain, this seemed destined to be. in some providential way. Sure enough, it was way more money than we had at the time, and probably have now either, but it was less than, what it could have sold for if it sold for commercial development. And there were I found out later, there were 3 commercial developers in the room that had been turning land like this into neighborhoods all across Manhattan. And for whatever reason, that day and in that moment, they didn't bid, and we did, and came home from the auction and couldn't believe really what had happened, because I knew we were going to try, but I really half expected to get outbid by somebody that would turn this all into a neighborhood. So, I don't know if that was the spirit of Bill Willis that intervened that day, but Becky and I have always, because of that, considered this more of a mission of stewardship than a mission of ownership. Somehow this fell into our hands that day. I tell people all the time, it was definitely not because of our cleverness, and it was simply, I guess the only thing we brought to the table is we had the courage to act.
Kail, you have taken some extra steps to promote the conservation of this land. It's a project you've been working on for a number of years that kind of culminated last year. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, and obviously it culminated with your help as well. Last year, after about 5 years in the making, we christened this with a conservation easement in conjunction and partnership with the Kansas Land Trust. So this 200-acre parcel, regardless of what happens to us or Becky and I or to Prairiewood even, this parcel can never have development on it from a physical human infrastructure standpoint. It can have trails, and it can have educational opportunities, no roads, no buildings, just habitat for the really wonderful, amazing variety of species that exist out in this area.
So this is a privately owned space, but we do have occasions where we open up this space to the public. We have open trail days, we have other kinds of programs. Why is it important to you to provide public access to this place?
Yeah, that's a good question. It probably really goes back to that sense Becky and I have of this is more about stewardship for us than ownership. And it almost felt like, well, we don't have any business owning this if we can't share it. We as people don't put energy into things we don't care about. And we don't care about things we don't have connection with. If we want people to care about those places that we believe are fundamental to the human experience, we've got to have people in the world that care about those places. And the only way that's going to happen is if people have a physical connection to them. They cannot just read about it in a book. They can't just be told about it by one of their parents or grandparents. These places can't protect themselves. It's interesting. Right now you can see by the way these 2 domes, these 2 grassland hills straight ahead. And that's one of the most unique features of this Willis Pond area we're looking at is in the background, there's these 2 almost symmetric dome hills. And there's such a landmark. So I just want to show you really quick here, Kail. I noticed some Canada geese, which I know you've pointed out that we have a lot of goose friends that come through. But these, I don't know if you can see when I zoom in though, there's one goose, I'm assuming a mama goose, that's like sitting on top of that little grassy, that area, probably protecting some young, but just like flat to the ground. And then there's another goose in the water just below that, but he's just stretched out as close to the water as can be. So he just looks like he's a floating decoy or something like that. That's exactly, I have seen Canada geese do that as well. And that is their kind of go-to hiding technique is they flatten out. They almost bend their wing shoulders toward the ground and they flatten their head down and they try to essentially become part of the landscape to detract any attention. This might be sort of a hard question to answer, but it's kind of
prescient at this moment, I think. We talk about connection and being able to touch and experience these things to care about them. But of course, right now in the world we're living in, it's hard to do that. It's hard to touch, it's hard to connect. In this time that we've been living in, have you found any meaningful ways to do that? Or how has connection been redefined for you during this time?
Wow, what an apropos question for our entire country right now. The human heart is meant for connection. So I think the whole world is asking those questions right now. Clearly people are not willing to allow isolation to mean disconnection. It just means a different type of connection. There's great connection to me in just sitting in the morning with a cup of coffee and watching the woodpeckers and actually the wood ducks that have been flying through the woods. We've had bald eagles in the mornings that almost without exception, the bald eagle comes and makes a run down the creek. We've got a bald eagle family that lives out here, and the blue herons that fish the pond area. So even just a cup of coffee and watching the bird life gives me a sense of connection with the land. But in terms of other types of connection, like everybody, we're spending some time doing things virtually, like what we're doing right now. I'm probably could choke back the emotion that I might say this with, but even spending time right now with you and this video, and in some ways that aren't as good as being there. There's a authentic sense of connection going on at this moment on two fronts. One, with the land that we're walking through together in a virtual kind of way, and also to each other. And without spending my afternoon together with you doing this, my day would have been less.
Kail, as we get towards the end here and we're about to sign off, what are your hopes that we might be able to accomplish through some of these conversations and these walks?
I think the word of the day seems to be connection. So I'll probably go with that. Hopefully in these moments, taking time to film, whether it's you or someone participating in this, it will allow them to see in ways that deepen their sense of connection, not because of their video skills, but because of their ability to see and then to show others what they see. And I think that would be a really beautiful way for connection to continue to be fostered during this.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I think despite us being kind of dispersed at the moment, I think there's a lot of great stories out there and a lot of really interesting journeys that we can hear from, and kind of using Prairiewood and using this place as sort of a catalyst for having some of those conversations. It's a good grounding point. So I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, we'll see where this goes. I appreciate you kicking us off here on this journey, and I hope we find some good stuff along the way.
The grand experiment is underway.
Let it begin.